I get so many questions about labs anytime I send out a survey to y'all. And I actually intended at one point to do a whole podcast series on labs, if you are a diehard listener and you remember me talking about that. But then it ended up evolving into me creating a free virtual professional development course because there was just so much to cover. I couldn't even cover it in just podcast episodes. And that's called Labs Unlimited. So if you have not used that, I'll link it in the show notes. But I wanted to share that because some of you have asked, like, where is that series you meant to do on labs? And I'm like, well, turn it into a free course because I had like things I needed to show you and not just tell you. I've also done an episode 186 on what to do if you're a science teacher who hates labs. So if that is a feeling that you feel too, you need to give that episode a listen. But today I want to do like one episode that's just a deep dive on labs all in one place. I'm going to answer about 15 questions that I received from my most recent podcast survey, all related to labs, and just really give you the lowdown in my answer on all things labs. We're going to talk about finding them, funding them, prepping for them, executing them, and then, of course, how do we assess them? So let's dive in. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. First and foremost, how do you find labs? How do you choose which ones to use? How do you create labs? So where do we begin? We begin with the beginning, which is the labs themselves. Where are we getting them? One of the questions I got related to this said, how to build engaging, fun labs, but not burn myself out trying to be creative. And so I want to tell you, if you feel this way, you are not alone. Writing labs, it's not an easy task at all. Each time I write a lab for any of my curricula that I'm working on, it's a solid week-long process, minimum. I'm coming up with ideas, then I'm having to kind of jot down an idea, then I have to order supplies, then I have to test it out, and then it doesn't work, so then I have to order more supplies, and there's a lot of drafts. So it's challenging. So I would only recommend writing your own labs and building those out if it is a creative outlet for you that you really, really enjoy and gives you energy to do so. That's something I discovered when I started teaching. I started creating my own resources just for my students with no intention to ever share them. And I just realized wow, this is so fun and this is my favorite part. And I get so excited to create something new and then test it with my students and see what they think and how effective it was. And then, go back to the drawing board if it wasn't. But that is not the case for everyone. So if it is the case for you and you need support creating labs from scratch, I recommend starting with the standard that you're trying to meet and then taking that standard. And I always recommend taking your standards and translating them into objectives that are just make more sense. And oftentimes one standard could have 3 to 10 objectives that come out of it. Basically, you're just taking that fancy standards language that all standards tend to be written in. If you're in a state like Georgia or even Texas, I think your standards are pretty specific. So you can really use those. But most other states, especially an NGSS-based state or a state that's adopted NGSS, a lot of states do their own thing, but they're essentially the NGSS. And I have a whole series on that if you need help with NGSS. But I think a lot of them are just kind of vague and not super specific. So I'm always saying, take your standard, translate that into practical objectives and skills, and then go from there. What's the point of this lab? So I'm going to connect it back to a standard through objectives and skills. I'm going to know what my end goal is. And then from there, I'm going to fill in with what they're going to explore, how they're going to do that to get to that point. Now, assuming most of you listening do not want to do that, I'm going to share some advice instead about sourcing labs. So I think the best way to source labs is to ask other high school science teachers what they use and what they love. So I think great questions to ask. This could be in your department, in your district, in a teacher Facebook group. Say, what are your favorite labs to do for fill in the blank topic? So any topic, put that there. Or I think it's great to search specific standards. Say, hey, I need something for HS PS 4-5. what do you guys use for this standard? I think that is a great place to start. I do think it's going to take some trial and error. And whenever you're piecing together, and I call it curating, when you're curating your curriculum yourself by piecing together a bunch of different people's work, it's going to have trial and error because those things weren't written to integrate and all go together and build upon each other. As opposed to when you do invest in units or curriculum that were written holistically and like the labs are strategically integrated with the notes and the inquiry activities and it's all put together to work together, like that's one thing. That's what I'm very passionate about with It's Not Rocket Science and what I do. And that's one of the reasons why I don't sell a lot of my labs and stuff a la carte. Because yeah, they could be cool standing on their own, but they're like 1,000 times richer within the context of all the other instructional resources we're using. So I do want to warn you, though it's totally fine to curate your curriculum. I'm not trying to say that like buying someone else's curriculum is for everyone. Curating your own curriculum might be what's best for you, but do know it does take some trial and error and like testing it out and be like, okay, I need to change up the analysis or change up this in order to make this better work for my students. Now, the one other tip I will say about engaging fun labs, please no labs for the sake of labs, okay? As we're going to see as we answer more of these questions, labs take a ton of energy, a ton of resources, time, prep. They take so much out of us. So let's not just do labs for the sake of checking the box. Like I'm doing a lot of labs. I think do labs with purpose. And that's where I want to plug. I have a free resource. It's my lab audit. It's in that free virtual professional development course, Labs When Limited. I will link it in the show notes so you can access it. Also, if you just literally Google Labs Unlimited, it should be the very first link from It's Not Rocket Science. You can grab it. But this lab audit is great because it has you walk through listing all of your labs, what you need for them, what standards or objectives or skills that they reach, and kind of like the why behind why you do it. It helps you really see where are the gaps, where am I doing labs that aren't actually accomplishing anything. And accomplishing, it could just accomplish fun. Like that is fair. And you're allowed to do labs just for fun. But if we're trying to be strategic with our budget, with our time, with our energy, we want to do labs really, really intentionally. And that's where the lab audit is super helpful. Now, similar to finding and choosing labs, definitely need to do the lab audit. Another question was, how do you find labs that are doable for all levels of students? And so what I would like to say to this is we'll talk about differentiating a lab in terms of its execution in just a little bit, but some labs and some specific topics, like I'm thinking about like a titration. To me, that's just a harder skill than others. Like it's hard to just like make that easier because it is something that is challenging for them to comprehend and also execute and, you know, do their twist without letting too much out. And like, there's just a lot that goes into it. So I think there's something to be said for just understanding that some things are going to be hard. Like that's just a hard skill. I would encourage you to worry less about making every individual lab accessible and very easy, or not easy, but like extremely doable for all students, and more about making sure that you're incorporating a variety of instructional tools in your toolbox to reach all students, and you're not evaluating students unfairly on the lab that is not necessarily accessible for all students, if that makes sense. So for example, let's start with the variety of instructional tools. There is a place for full-blown inquiry investigations in your science classroom. There's also a place for traditional cookie cutter labs. There's a place for partial inquiry lab activities. There's a place for lab stations. There's a place for explorative inquiry stations. There's a place for model building. There's a place for creative activities. I think what makes learning accessible and doable for all starts with making sure that we're using a variety of tools in order to reach all. So I would be cognizant of that, because I think if every single thing you do is a full-blown inquiry investigation, like, yeah, that's going to be exhausting trying to scaffold that for such a variety of learners. Where, you know, maybe some topics, we're going to learn it in a more traditional cookie cutter lab setting. The focus is not going to be on the creation of the lab and the designing of it and the doing of the lab as much as it is going to be the graphing and the analyzing and applying it to what we're learning in the class. Whereas maybe other topics, it is going to be more about the process and the design and things like that. So that's one way I want to encourage you. Now, the other thing I mentioned in terms of making labs doable for all levels of students really comes down to how you're assessing it. And I'll talk about assessing at the end here. But I think we put so much pressure on like grading every part of the lab and them getting every part right that we forget the whole reason why we're doing labs in the first place, which is to give them these hands-on learning experiences that then they can connect back to what we're learning about, like in lecture and in all these other tools that we're using. And so I think one of the ways that you can best make a lab doable for all is to, I don't want to say like lower the bar on how you're assessing, but like loosen the grip on the reins a little bit and not have your students so stressed out about making sure they get it all down and get it all done that they're not actually like enjoying and engaging in the learning experience of the lab. So that's one way I want to encourage you there in terms of finding labs. So yeah, there's going to be some trial and error. Yes, I want you to not do labs for the sake of labs. I want you to be strategic with your labs. And then I also want you to have a lot of variety so that you are doing labs that can serve all levels of students. It's unrealistic with most likely your course load and your time allotment that you have to prep and the resources you have to take every single lab and adjust it so it's perfectly differentiated for every single child. But there are ways that we can differentiate in the actual execution, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, so that's finding labs. Let's talk about funding labs. 2 questions I got. 1, how do you best fund your lab? And 2, dream items for a lab. If money wasn't a question, what would you order? So first, how to best fund your lab. I'm not the person to answer this, or maybe I actually am, because I've never had a lab budget ever. I've also never applied for any grants to help fund my lab. And so if that is something you have done, or you have a unique way that you funded labs in your classroom, I would love to hear from you. You could apply to be a guest on the podcast, which I'll link in the show notes. It'd be super fun to talk to you. Or you can just DM me on Instagram if you want, or email me at rebecca@rocketscienceclassroom.com. That is not my forte. Here's what I will tell you. I was at a large Title I public school where we did have a lab fee. It was $7 for on grade level CP students, $14 for honor students. And there was like obviously exemption for students that, were not able to cover that fee. But even just getting that from the majority of students really helped to offset the cost of lab supplies. And that was just something like the department was doing when I got there. And it was like, hey, if you're taking a lab science, this is going to be the fee type thing. I think anatomy and AP sciences also had higher fees just for specimens and things like that. So that's one potential option if you wanted to look into that. For me personally, at the other school I was at where we did not have that and it was just like no money, lots of problems here, I chose certain labs to kind of push for getting a purchase order to cover that really mattered to me. So for example, our ecosystem in a bottle investigation that I do in biology, it requires a lot of materials. It is a more expensive lab, but like everything else I can kind of like throw together myself. This is one that it's like, it's an investment and it's a lot of consumable resources. So I wanted help every year investing in that. And I think because I didn't ask for a purchase order for every single lab, they were always quick to say yes when I did ask. And that was a big one. And I was able to show like, this is a month-long investigation we're doing. Here's all the ways it's going to like change their learning experience. So that was really received well from my admin, from me. My solution, instead of finding money, you can save money 2 ways. You can spend less or make more. And so instead of trying to make more or attain more, I just was like, I'm just going to spend less and I'm going to come up with labs because as I mentioned, I love writing them that use the cheapest, most accessible supplies possible, that use as few consumables as possible. And if it is a consumable, it's something that I can write a PO for. So that way, once I have the materials, I have them forever and I can take them with me or whatever. And that's the beauty of when you do buy things yourself, because like you're taking it with you if you go. So that is why I personally write labs the way that I do, so I can use as few resources as possible. So my recommendation, if you cannot find funding for your labs, is to find a curriculum writer who aligns with your values. And I think we get really stressed out about, do I have enough wet labs, or I'm doing too many dry labs, or I should be doing more real chemistry instead of kitchen chemistry. And I would push back on that. Like, I think if you're teaching an AP science, for sure, like, let's give your kids some exposure to chemicals, but they can learn so many rich things from kitchen chemistry. They can learn so much from dry labs as opposed to wet labs in biology. And you can still use a lot of the equipment that you might have on hand without all of the other things you might not have access to. So I would encourage you to find curriculum and resources that align with what you have or what you don't have, because there are people out there. I'm one of them that like, I'm writing for that exact type of person. And that's why I really can't answer this next question. The dream items for a lab, if money wasn't a question, I couldn't possibly relate to this in the slightest because I cannot imagine being in this situation where I have like an unlimited budget. Like, honestly, I was thinking about it. I'm like, my dream lab experience or supplies is access to running water and lab tables. Like, the bar is very low for me because I just didn't have much more than that. So I'll link my supplies spreadsheets in the show notes. You can check them out. They're for each of my curricula, so you could at least see something to go off of. I like how I made them. I think I did this last summer, but I essentially divided all the supplies for each curriculum and put them in one spreadsheet. And I made like a consumables tab, a non-consumables, just like a general supplies. Like, I like to have computer paper and markers and scissors on hand. And then I had like optional things for demos and then things you need for the chemical supply closet. I like organizing the supplies this way because typically like once a year, my old department chairs would be like, all right, I'm like restocking the supply closet. What chemicals do you need? And I always knew exactly what I needed because it was organized that way. I like when parents ask what donations they can make, I have a quick reference list of like, hey, we can always use, paper towels or computer paper, but if you want to like help invest in this one specific lab, these are consumables I need for that. And it was also helpful just being organized if money did come in. Like, if we did, especially when I was at a private school, if someone did just donate money to the science lab, like I was ready to order things for the labs that I wanted to do. So I'll share those in case you just want something to go off of. But my answer to this question for you, since again, I'm not really the person to answer this question, is what are you passionate about? Like, if you are passionate about microbiology, get some microscopes. That sounds fun for you. If you're passionate about genetics and biotech, like, get gel electrophoresis apparatuses. Like, if you've got some physics demos you've always wanted to do, like, get whatever you need for that. I think focus on what you're passionate about. I'm passionate about being creative and using the resources I have access to creatively. So that's where my dreams don't seem as big as some of yours might be, but that's fine. But I'd really think about what you are passionate about. Or if there's like an elective you've always wanted to teach, like an anatomy or a forensics, and then get some stuff to start, that would be pretty cool too. Okay, so you found your labs, you funded your labs, or you found labs that don't require a lot of materials. Now let's talk about planning or prepping for those labs, all the stuff you're doing on the back end. One of the questions I received was, best supply management tips, storage, give to each group, which is time consuming, or just have like a station that all the students go to. So I will tell you all, I never had the space to really prep and store labs well for each group. Like, I love those videos on Instagram and TikTok of like the baskets and each drawer. Like, every lab group has their own drawer where you put their lab supplies. Sounds amazing. To me, that sounds like a waste of space and a waste of my time personally. I always prefer just to have one station this is where the supplies are. This is where the prep is. Typically, it would be my demo table at the front of the classroom. Students come to me and get what they need. You can give them the bin, like the cube bin you're seeing on the internet and on Pinterest, and let them fill their own to transport it back to wherever they're doing their lab, if that's what you want. But to me, I like that because then I can supervise the distribution of the supplies. And especially if we are using chemicals or something like that, I can make sure I have my eyes on like what they're getting while also not spending a ton of my time divvying up the supplies. It just doesn't seem worth it. I know that requires more movement, and a lot of people don't like movement in their classroom, which I totally get. I personally like movement because I just like kids getting up and out of their seats. I always have my students on test days and lab days. I would have a sign that I put on my door, like, we're doing a lab. It was like bright neon, or it's lab day or it's test day. And they were encouraged not to bring their backpacks on those days, just so we had more room to shuffle back and forth in really tiny classrooms. I also recommend if you have different labs set up for different classes, do some color coding. Like, I had different colors I assigned to each class, and it would be like, okay, they knew that theirs is all the blue stuff. They don't touch the stuff that's lime green or something like that. You could have 2 separate prep stations set up if you have that room. I recommend, this is my hot take, if you have 3 or more preps, you need lab carts. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google lab utility cart and you'll see in the images exactly what I mean. I had one of those when I was in a non-lab space. I taught in an old computer room. And so anytime I did a lab, I had to use one of those and like roll down to someone else's classroom. But then even when I graduated to like an actual lab space, when I taught AP Bio, they gave me a real lab. It was one of those labs where it was like the perimeter of the room was the lab tables. And then we had like desks in the middle. So it was a little clunky and it was hard. And I didn't have a lot of like just spare space for storing stuff. So I love those utility carts because I had one that was just 2 shelves, but I could have one class's lab on the top and one class's lab on the bottom. And I could have 2 prepped at one time. And then it's easy to like move those off to the side. Another question about planning and prepping is how to handle lab prep for 4 preps if you only had 1 plan period, which I'm hearing this a lot. Like I only have 1 plan period. Same. Who has more than 1 plan period? If that's you, I just want you to know that you are blessed. You are highly favored. To have more than 1 planning period is awesome. I was spoiled because I did my student teaching and then my first teaching job. They were 2 different schools, but at both of those, we were block schedule, which meant one was an AB all year, one was a semester block. But in both situations, I had 90 minutes every day. And then I switched to traditional. I only had 50 minutes, like gag. That was horrible. So if that is you, here's the things I think you need. You need a TA. You need a teacher's assistant. I will link a blog post about this in the show notes. I'll link a podcast episode where I talk about free ways your admin can support you, and a TA is it. You get a student to volunteer to be your TA during one of their class periods. It's like a study hall for them. And they can put it on their college transcript that they did this and they served you and helped in this way. But they can help you with this, cleaning things up, prepping things, and then you can just review their prep and make sure they set it up right. The second thing you need is you need a utility lab cart, maybe 2. If you have 4 preps, maybe 2, because they tend to have 2 shelves, so 1 for each lab. And then you can wheel those into like a chemical supply closet, into a lab prep room, into someone else's classroom that's bigger than yours. Like you have some options there. But that, again, if you have 3 or more lab preps, this person mentioned 4, you need a utility lab cart. It's like $145. Your school should buy that for you. It's a non-consumable, reusable resource. They own it. You won't take it with you when you leave. It's worth it. They can borrow it for Spirit Week when they got to move stuff around or whatever, but like that is a must-have. And then the third thing I'd say is a must-have is a flat calendar on your desktop that's like a month by month, like a month at a glance, so you can see the whole month. And remember I told you I color-coded my classes? I would color code on the desktop flat calendar what the labs were and like which classes are having labs which days. So I would try, like for some semesters, I'd have like 3 sections of general biology. I would have all of the general biology labs on one day because I like to batch in that way. But then I would make sure that the other class, the physical science lab, was on a different day because that would help with like the lab storage and where you're putting all those things. So you need a TA, a utility lab cart, and a flat desktop calendar to kind of map these things out. And you can use those friction erasable pens so you can color code, but still erase if you have to change things up. Related to this is how do you plan for labs for multiple preps and not wear yourself out? And this is hard. And this is one of the reasons why I love that I wrote all my curriculum and I did it all in advance, because I'm not spending time curating curriculum and figuring out what labs I'm doing or whatever. Like I have my unit plans done before the year started. That's how I managed when I had 5 preps. And then I'm staggering things as I lesson plan them. So if you use It's Not Rocket Science stuff, you know that I give you a suggested order, but you can change that up. And so I would stagger things as I wrote it out on my flat desktop calendar to make sure I'm not getting exhausted. Now, you may find it better to stack stuff rather than stagger. Sometimes I did feel this way. Like sometimes I was like, you know what? I'm just going to have a lab in every class this Wednesday, and I'm going to get a venti chai, dirty chai with espresso shots in it, chai tea latte, and I'm going to come to school and I'm going to be jacked up on caffeine and we're going to push through. And then I'm going to go home and crawl into a ball and sleep for the rest of the day after, as opposed to staggering them. But that just totally depends on your energy level. But that's one of the reasons why I love lesson planning in advance and kind of knowing what you're going to do in advance. And then that way you can map these things out a little bit easier and try to stagger or stack depending on your personality. Lastly, when it comes to prep, someone asked, how do you manage labs in the classroom with 5 different classes and have room to store the parts that are not done yet? So we've kind of talked about storage. I've talked about that lab cart, but this is really important. I highly recommend, and I talk about this all in my Labs Unlimited free course, a 2.25, if you will, day lab schedule, so that it is a rare unicorn occurrence type of day for me to ever have to hold on to a lab setup for more than one day. Okay, so here's what I mean by the 2.25. I recommend blocking out labs to take 2.25 days. That 0.25 is you need like a 10 to 20 or 15, whatever, somewhere in that range. You need 10 to 20 minutes to intro and set the context and prepare students for a lab. I like to do that at the end of a class period before we're going to do a lab. We're going to read through it. We're going to talk about it. If it's an inquiry investigation, we're going to design it, or get into that. You'd obviously need more than 20 minutes if it's a full-blown inquiry lab. I'm answering their questions they have. We are getting prepared for the lab on that 0.25 day. Then on the actual lab day, I try to only have one day, and the only goal is to get the data, period. So that at the end of that day, I'm cleaning up the lab. Because when you have 5 different classes, it is so challenging to keep stuff stored, especially if they're in process on something. So now it's been 1.25 lab days. On the next lab day, so this would be kind of like day 3, although I call that 0.25 day day 0. So you got day 0, day 1, day 2. On day 2, that's when you're doing the graph and the analysis and the conclusion and all of that stuff. So I really recommend that because it is really hard to hang on to a lab over multiple days. And if you have to, that's where having the utility cart is really helpful because then you can put things on it and kind of wheel it out of the way as needed. I do have a couple labs that kind of stretch over multiple, but they're low key. I have one in biology with gummy bears and osmosis, and we kind of get data over 3 days, but those are just in little plastic cups, and it's easy I would line them up along the perimeter of my walls. And that was pretty easy to kind of keep out. My ecosystem in a bottle did take up a lot of room, but anytime I did that in my biology classes, I rearranged my entire classroom and had a corner in front of my one solitary window. That was my ecosystem in a bottle corner. And I rearranged the tables or the desks or whatever I was working with around that so that that could stay up for a month. But I think that should be the exception, not the norm, because it's just too hard with 5 different classes. The other thing I'd say too, when it comes to storing parts and things like that, is another spreadsheet that comes with Labs Unlimited is my lab equipment storage spreadsheet. And it's something that you can grab from this free course and you share it with your department and you guys can track where everything is. So if someone has 4 hot plates and you've got 2 and then they've got all the graduated cylinders, you know where stuff is. And then you know if you need to borrow it, where you can access it. That's a great thing too if you just don't have space in your room to store anything. That was something that I created for my department when I was in that computer lab and literally had no storage in my room and everything was everywhere else. And I could never find stuff when I needed it for labs to set up on my little lab utility cart. And so this kind of kept everyone organized on where stuff was so that we could know if we needed to use it, where we could find it. Okay, let's talk running or executing labs and then assessing them. I know this is getting long. I'm so sorry. I hope you hang with me here. Okay, how to keep labs on track, given that it works better to use class time to write their analysis. So I'm not 100% sure what this person was asking, but I think in general, they're just saying the timing and the pacing of the labs and building in class time to do the write-up. That's where I'm again going to push that 2.25 day lab schedule. I think it really helps too to have simple goals each day. The first day, we're just overviewing the lab. The second day, you're just getting data and cleaning up. The third day, we're literally just going to be analyzing and writing it up. I think labs feel so chaotic and frenetic when we're rushing. And if you can just slow it down, and I know you have no time, but that's where we're going to do the lab audit and make sure we're doing no labs just for the sake of doing a lab. We're doing labs intentionally. That way we can spend more good quality time on the labs we are doing rather than just trying to get through a quantity of labs. Okay, now let's talk about differentiating labs. This kind of goes back to that original question of making all labs doable for all students. I think it takes a lot of energy and effort on your part to rework a lab for a bunch of different levels. So again, I like to just have a diversity of instructional resources I'm using to reach all students. And then when it comes to the actual lab, you kind of have 2 options and you can play this by ear based on your students and then also the specific lab that you're looking at differentiating. But one option is to divide your lab groups so that there are diverse ability levels within each group. And then they can kind of help each other. The faster, more high achieving student can help the one that is struggling and a bit lower. Another option is to divide groups based on ability level and need level so that the groups that need the least help are working together and kind of out of your hair because you don't need to help them at all. And then the group that needs the most help is the physically closest to you in terms of where they're doing their lab. So you can engage and check in and walk them through parts a little bit easier. I also recommend strategically assigning lab roles to make sure all students are engaged, especially if you're doing the diverse ability groups, to make sure that the students that maybe are lower achieving are getting a good role to really engage. Like they're getting to do some hands-on parts of this lab and they're not just getting bulldozed by the highest achieving person in their group. Also, I recommend if you have the supplies, smallest groups as possible always. It just forces more people to be able to get engaged and get involved in the lab and get their hands on things, even though you kind of have to run around more, helping more people. So related to this is this question of how do I increase the rigor of labs for scholars who crave a challenge while also managing students who are struggling? So if this is your case and you're trying to make labs harder for some students, I tend to focus on the other, like how do I make it more accessible for the lower students? But if you want to increase rigor for some, I would divide the groups up potentially, again, one of those two ways. If you're being intentional about diverse abilities, I would be encouraging these people, like you're going to be the leader of their group and it's your job to be teaching and supporting them. Being able to teach someone else about something and support them, that's a very high thinking level, and that's going to increase the rigor, expecting them to do that. And then it's also going to support the students that are struggling because they're going to get some help. Other option though would be if you do divide it the other way and you put all of those high achieving scholars, that was the word this person used, together, is give that group that's going to finish the fastest more responsibilities. Okay, y'all are done. Now you're going to do the cleanup of the lab. You're going to do a reflection on the lab. Tell me how we could do this differently or more effectively in the future. Help me rewrite it. Go ahead and edit the procedures because they didn't work as well this time. Or take them and divvy them up among other groups if they finish early and have them help those groups. I have a whole episode on fast finishers, episode 222. You can check out my help with that. Okay, next two questions related to running and executing labs. How do I implement more labs in bio and chem? Like I said from the beginning, quality is greater than quantity. In my opinion, check out the lab audit and the Labs When Limited free course. I think it'll really help you. Also, I think there are so many good labs for biology and chemistry. Like it shouldn't be hard to find ideas to curate those. Again, ask other teachers in your department, ask people in your district, get in a Facebook group of teachers. There's so many big ones and say, hey, what's your favorite lab for this topic? Just to get you some ideas of the ones that are worthwhile in terms of implementing. And then the last question was how to do labs that are engaging, low preparation, and minimal materials. And I have two recommendations. Sorry, but one would be use It's Not Rocket Science resources. Like that is my goal, is to create engaging resources that also simplify teachers' lives so that teaching is not rocket science. Like that is what I'm here for. You can check out my supplies spreadsheets that I'm linking that are free that come with each curriculum to see the kind of stuff that I use. And if you don't want to do that, totally fine. I own that It's Not Rocket Science is not for everyone. I totally get that. But the lab audit, that is for everyone and that is free. Grab that in the Labs Unlimited freebie course and use that to go through your labs and make sure that you're selecting the best ones for your capacity and the resources you have available to you. Okay, last but not least, we have to talk about assessing labs. So I have 3 questions I got about this. First, how can I effectively assess students in lab without overworking myself? I talk about this in extreme detail in my labs virtual professional development course. That is like an actual paid course about labs that goes into a lot more details. But for brevity's sake, since this is getting long, I will say I highly recommend y'all only grading parts of a lab and not the entire thing. Which leads to the next question, because I've talked about this before, is someone asked, well, how do you decide what is worth grading and what's just extra? So to me, everything in the lab is important. That's why I don't tell students, like, I'm only going to grade your graph. Like, I want them to do everything because walking through that learning process is important and useful. But often I decide what I want to grade based on what we're learning. So based on this specific lab, I think the most important thing is that they understand the analysis questions. So I'm going to go through those. Or based on this specific lab, I want to make sure that they really, really did that graph right. And so I'm going to focus on that. Another way you can do this, which I've done in the past, I did this in particular when I taught physical science to 8th graders, was like I kind of went through how I graded throughout the order of the year. So the beginning of the year, I pretty much was always grading hypotheses and pre-lab stuff. And that's what I would grade for accuracy. The rest would be for completion, but then we'd go over it. And then once I kind of saw that they kind of mastered their writing hypotheses and all that stuff, then I moved on to like, okay, now I'm going to really get nitty gritty in graphing. And like, I'm going to mark up every single thing on your graph until you start making graphs right. And then once I felt like they had kind of mastered graphs, then I really focused on grading the analyses for accuracy, that kind of thing. So I think that's one way you can kind of choose what you're going to grade and what you're going to not grade. But I do think as much as you can, take the pressure off grading the lab so that they can just focus on learning is so important. I have so many memories from high school of like not having any idea what was going on in the lab because I was so worried about just getting the right stuff down on the paper. And that's like totally missing the point. So I kind of wanted to set my own students free from that when they were in my classroom and let them just like focus on the experience. Okay, which leads to the last question. How to grade 140 lab reports in a timely manner without going over contract hours? And my answer is simply don't do it. Do not grade 140 lab reports. That sounds terrible. I have an entire podcast episode about what happened when I stopped assigning and grading formal lab reports. You can check that out in episode 105. I think especially now more than ever, because the AI stuff is new since I even recorded that episode. Like students are going to be using AI as a companion for their lab report. And until we figure out how to use AI to help us grade the lab reports, like you're still doing way more work than your students actually are. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them potentially using AI to help them write their lab report, but that's just making their life easier and your life is still hard. And I don't want your life to be hard. I want your life to be simple. So I want to set you free and I want to give you permission if you're listening to maybe just, you're not going to grade lab reports because you're not going to assign lab reports anymore. So think about maybe trying that. Okay, that was long. I'm so sorry if that was too long, but I hope it was really helpful. And I hope out of all of that, if there is one take-home challenge you have from this, it's download Labs when it's limited. Do it alone for the lab audit. And then also that supplies spreadsheet that you can share with your department and get really organized about where your stuff is. I think that's a great starting point for feeling more on top of things with labs. Also, another great take-home challenge would be like, let's order one of those lab utility carts. And I don't want you paying for it. Like, let's ask your admin to buy you this. If you have 3 or more labs, like this, I feel like I would argue is a need so that you can prep labs and keep them out of the way, especially if you're in a small classroom. I will link in the show notes the Labs When Limited freebie course and anything else I mentioned. And you can find those at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 228. And if you have some things to say about labs and how you run them and what's worked really well in your classroom when it comes to labs, I would love for you to come on the podcast. You can apply to be a guest at bit.ly/SSSguest. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.